Working autonomously actually means that your leader doesn't have to be paranoid and worried about breathing down your neck, asking about details because they can't trust that you're going to be sharing the right information at the right time, right? So you operating autonomously is actually, you should be communicating more, not less. You should be communicating and sharing what you are thinking, what are potential risks of what's going on, what are things that were unexpected as you were executing. All of those things actually increase your leaders' trust in you to operate autonomously because they can then trust that you have good judgment around surfacing things that you should be surfacing.
Welcome to the Product Tea with Leah. I am your host, Leah Darrin, and we are about to spill the tea with the best from tech about product growth and senior leadership topics. Good day, everyone. Today we spill the tea with the entrepreneurial force reshaping the landscape of education and online learning. As a co-founder of Maven, she has propelled this edtech platform to success with a staggering 25 million backing from industry giants like First Round and Andreessen Horowitz. Before that, she began her journey alongside Seth Godin, launching the innovative Alt MBA, which pioneered the cohort-based course model and expanded learning boundaries across a measly 55 countries only. She's a revered mentor and advisor, sharing her wealth of experience with upcoming tech firms and seasoned CEOs alike. Her engagements include heavyweights like Uber, TikTok, and Netflix, focusing on executive communication and influence through her acclaimed courses. And today, we delve into her visionary approach to building products and her razor-sharp communication style. Welcome to the Product Tea to this VC-backed founder turned executive coach and one of my friends, Wes Kao. How are you doing, Wes, this morning?
Good. Really excited to be here, Leah.
I almost stumbled over your introduction because there was so much stuff to put in there.
I'm honored.
I just want you to take note of that. Wes, can you introduce yourself maybe to the audience in case I forgot something, or was this a good enough introduction?
This was a great introduction.
Okay, then we just take it off from here. What do people get wrong about you once they get to know you?
I think that people assume from far away that I'm a very disciplined person. And I think I sometimes get the fruits of labor that disciplined people often get. But behind the scenes, it's propelled by obsession. So I'm less so, about rigid, motivation and getting myself to do things that I don't want to do and discipline in that sense, and much more about I just tend to choose things that I'm obsessed with and do those and things where I enjoy the journey. So I think you can reach success in many different ways. And yeah, I think obsession is really underrated.
Can you be disciplined without obsession?
I think there are a lot of people who are good at getting themselves to do things they don't want to do.
I'm not one of these people. I cannot do it. I would have thought that once you put your mind on something, you can be really very, very disciplined. I would have put you there for sure.
No, I have to want to do it and I have to be obsessed with it. I have to find it interesting and intellectually stimulating and fascinating in some way. Otherwise, I can't bring myself to do it. And I've actually noticed as I've gotten older and more senior in my career that it's harder to get myself to do things that I'm not interested in or don't want to do. Before, in my youth, I feel like I was able to just use brute force and just power my way through and be like, I need to learn this thing, so I'm going to learn it. Whereas now I'm like, I might need to do this, but I really don't want to. And I'm just going to consider that a constraint and see if I can work around it or, put myself in a situation where that thing is not necessary, where it's less relevant, and focus more on my strengths, more on things that actually interest me.
So this is an interesting one because I've talked about this on the podcast maybe once or twice when I was talking about my startup that I founded where I made the mistake. I'm pretty sure I made this mistake by not getting a co-founder in for the things that I'm not obsessed about. The things that I don't love. Bookkeeping, dealing with distributors, international kind of shipping details.
I read your post on that and I was like, oh my God. I was so impressed that you got yourself to do it at all. That kind of stuff, the logistical, detailed, accounting, taxes, bookkeeping, that kind of stuff, biz ops, I just can't do it. I can't bring myself to do it.
I hate it. Let's just not commenting on the quality of it. So it is funny because when you have whenever it's about business metrics, shoveling the numbers and figuring out how much gross margin you have and so forth. I love that stuff, right? I love putting together Excel sheets and see how things are going. I love data. I love getting visibility into complex systems. But dealing with distributors across the UK, like with all these problems with taxes, I was not doing a good job. And I think I left a lot of money as well on the road because I was not good at it. So I do not think, and we're just going to make a statement, and maybe this also leads good into our topic. I think if you're not passionate about something, I don't think you can be exceptionally good at it. You don't need to be good at something as well, or like on everything, of course, but I think you will hit a specific limit. I don't know a single person that can just force themselves to be extraordinary in something where they're not passionate about. They can get to a reasonable level of good, good enough.
Yeah.
I just don't think you can get there. I don't know. Maybe.
Yeah, I think I agree.
Yeah, we should evaluate this at some point. Anyways, but what we're going to talk about today is something that I envy you a lot about. And that is whenever I open your newsletter, the first problem is that you have more subscribers than me, which is a problem, right? Like as a competitive person, I need to have more, which is owed to you being extremely consistent over the last years. I don't know, maybe I've got to say decades, but it always makes me feel old, about being present, and having a very specific communication style. And this communication style is very much on point. And I can say this because you have some of the hardest hitting summaries, I feel like, and one-liners to kind of encompass on what is coming afterwards in an article. And this is something that I struggle with quite a lot. I think I got also quite good at it, but and so forth. But like, you have a very good talent in kind of like the storytelling aspect. And I think this is an underappreciated talent when we talk about how do you communicate your value with leadership. And with leadership, we mean usually like people that have something above you, either in power, in money, or in importance, or like they're from a different silo and so forth. And you talk about this stuff quite a lot. I'm really excited to talk about this today also with you. So can you give us a little bit of context? You are running right now a lot of courses around this. You talk about this, like about executive communication. How do I talk to someone that is in executive leadership and so forth? And to me, this is very often a topic about summarization. And I just wanted to lead into this with a very small example that I always get when I teach my own cohort stuff about product-led growth. Most of the time, you teach a framework. People learn about it. They think that, oh, this is nice. This is a cool thing. And there's always like the first time where you do something. And as soon as it involves someone else, like you need to get buy-in for like, hey, I would like to spend resources, or like I would like to change something that has been established for a long time for whatever reason. And then they have a question. So, hey, Leah, I think product-led growth is great, but like, how can I get buy-in from my boss to do this? Because it's very obvious, right? Like it's always very obvious on like what's wrong in our current company and so forth. And you talk about this topic quite a lot. Can you give us a short intro as well? Like, what is this actually about?
Yeah, I think with executive communication, the toughest thing is that sometimes you know something is the right path or the wrong path, and you know it so deeply and have so much conviction. But unless you can get someone else on board, you can't actually do the thing that you know is right. And that can be so painful. It can feel so frustrating. And I think that's why investing in the skill of communication is so important. I think one of the issues with learning communication as a topic is it's often taught in a really high level, fluffy way. So how many of us, probably like 99%, have heard about that statistic of, only X% of communication is actually the words that you're saying, the content. X% is your eye contact, your tone of voice, your cadence, your body language, project, look people in the eye, etc. These are all, once you reach a certain level in your career, it's so obvious. Like, yes, like we are all doing those things. We are projecting our voice when we talk to people, right? Like we are mindful of our body language. So I really am more interested in getting many levels deeper of what are the things that you really need to get better at when you are communicating with other smart people in your organization. Usually most operators, most leaders, when we are in discussions, in meetings, writing strategy docs, memos, Slack messages, sharing a recommendation, sharing an update, proposing a solution, discussing our ideas, this is not a TED Talk. This is not public speaking 101 where like you have a super scripted speech and it's all, every word is laid out. It's much more dynamic. It's back and forth. It takes multiple attempts. It's much more about getting to understand the other person's often very legitimate concerns and questions, and being able to address them with good logic. So one of the most important things that I teach in my course is the logic of what you're saying matters a lot. And most people either, one, don't share their thought process and don't share their rationale at all. So the other person has no idea why you feel so passionately about this, and you just keep repeating yourself, turning red in the face. Or they do share their thought process. They do share their rationale around how did I arrive at where I'm getting at? What's evidence that's supporting what I'm saying? But it's either incomplete or weak, or there's a lack of insight, or it doesn't really address the thing that the person is pointing out. And so you just end up going around in circles, repeating yourself. And that's just not helpful. It's like that Einstein quote about, trying to get a different result from doing the same thing over and over. Usually with increasing levels of fervor and passion, trying to convey, the message you want to convey. And so I'm a big proponent of making sure the underlying idea of what you are saying is actually very, very solid. It's not just about, quote unquote, communication tactics, public speaking tactics to try to trick people into believing you because you phrase something in a, persuasive way.
So this is an interesting question, because when I actually reflect the question backwards to the people who also ask me something along these lines as well, then they usually try to say so I need to build a business case, right? So a lot of what you just said is also alluding to this fact in terms of how do I build a good case for what I'm trying to do? Still, there is obviously also a lot about how do you say it as well? It's not just about the content. It's also about exactly in terms of laying the road in how did I get there and so forth. But here's an interesting question that I see quite often when I'm being approached and they want to convince me of something. So in a typical CPO fashion, that usually means that, hey, can we not build feature this over that? Either it comes from the top, it comes from the bottom, or it comes from the side. It doesn't really matter. And I think it was very difficult for me to kind of understand from a leader's perspective before I was a leader in that sense, that oftentimes these conversations feel like you want to convince me of something. So you're becoming a salesperson of an idea rather than a partner that is trying to work out the best idea with me. And there's two parts to this that I always find a little bit jarring, and I would love to hear input on this. And the first one is that we should never forget that if you bring something to someone that is above you, let's just make a very simple example in terms of there's a product manager that tries to convince the CPO of building a specific feature. I will always evaluate this idea on, first of all, is it good for the business, but then also is it good for me? Whether I want this or not, that's just the reality, right? I have specific goals in the context of what I'm working. That does not mean that everything has to be transactional, right? And we're just not living in a world where everything is just for the business. And I think a lot of people are forgetting this in a sense. It's not about being transactional in the sense of oh, what does this do for Leah? But what I'm saying is that if you are recommending me something that is very much not aligned with the company strategy, that is just so much out there and there's not a lot of validation, then you're basically telling me that, hey, Leah, trust me on this. If it goes wrong, it's your fault, Leah, but just trust me, right? It's like a kind of like a trust me bro thing. And that's how this oftentimes feel. And the way to get actually around that is not to convince me more. It's not about that. It's just exactly as you said, you lay out the things as they are, but then you partner with that person. Do you think there's also a good case in there? Can you help me build this? This is how I look at this. Is this also how you are approaching this in this particular example?
Absolutely. I think that people can easily become what I call a single-minded martyr when they have an idea that they want to pitch. And you get so into your idea and so wrapped around it, and you want to convince this other person, and all you want is a yes. You want a green light. You want buy-in, and the point is not buy-in. Buy-in would be nice, but ultimately you want to make a good decision. That is actually your end goal. So a good decision for the company, for your team right now might be a no for this particular idea, because there are other priorities that warrant our resources more, right? And that is not a loss on your part. You should not see that as a personal failing that, I should have done this and this and this differently. You should always reflect on what you could have done differently, but the goal is to make a good decision at the end of the day. And so I think keeping that in mind shifts the way that you advocate. And instead of being a single-minded martyr where you only talk about the pros of this idea, the advantages, the upside, the potential gains, you also proactively volunteer what could go wrong. What might that look like? What are reasons potentially not to do this? When you share reasons to potentially not do something and you are grounded and level-headed and rational about showing the whole picture, it builds a lot of credibility. It shows that you are not just trying to like persuade someone at all costs. And then to your point, if it blows up, your manager is the one who has to deal with it anyway and has to clean up the mess, right? You are showing that you are going in clear-eyed about the situation, wanting to make a good decision for all parties involved.
I think this is a really good point, and I want to tackle this maybe like one by one now. So you mentioned credibility. So do I believe what is in front of me is working is dependent on a couple of factors. One of them is also, like you said, the case itself. Can I understand how it has been laid out to me, which would be like the language, right? Like, can I actually understand what you're saying? Like, do I have the context to understand what you're saying? But then there's also like this really, I think, this critical thing where I feel like you're also someone that excels at this quite well also in her articles, which is the bandwidth. Like, how much bandwidth does someone have in a specific conversation? So like whenever you go into a communication style of like a meeting or whatever, you have a specific amount of resource that you can spend on this person. Before they either, they go out there like, hey, this is not worth my time, or I do not understand what you mean, and so forth. And specifically, the more levels you skip, I feel the more you have to be in control over this. And what I mean with that is like, ultimately, this is about, are you capable of creating a good summary of your thoughts that is good enough, almost like a post or like an article on Substack, to have someone say, yes, I would like to read more now. And I feel like this is oftentimes violated, where you get into meetings and then for 5 to 10 minutes, you hear people talk about all kinds of things, and I have no idea what they want to tell me. Is this a $5 million idea? Is this a $15 million idea? What do you want to say? So will you also subscribe to this idea? Because I really don't like it when someone is starting to present me data without telling me what they are actually trying to prove in a simple, cohesive way with a strong argument, even though it might not be proven yet, right? Like if I'm going to say then, okay, so tell me why you believe this, then we are in a good conversation. It's actually not bad. It's good, right? Do you think about that in this way as well? Like we have sometimes presentations as well on stage from people that are just like, they're just busy telling you for like 10 minutes, like who they are, what they do, and you still do not know, like, what are you talking about, man? I don't understand.
Yeah, I think with executives especially, you want to get to your point as fast as possible. I actually think that a lot of the communication techniques that you would use with executives are the same that you would use with your own manager, with your direct reports, with peers. I think the difference is that executives tend to be even more impatient and you have limited chances at bat. So you might talk to them once a month. So that's 3 times a quarter. Whereas you might talk to your manager 30 times a quarter, right? Or more. And so, if you present poorly, seem incoherent and disorganized and not like a clear thinker in 1 out of 3 of those interactions, let's say it's a monthly business meeting, that's a third of the impressions that exec has of you. So it feels higher stakes because of those limited interactions. But I actually think that in terms of the inputs of how do you show up and bring solid rationale, frame what you're saying up front, offer to elaborate in a couple different directions, be concise, like all of those things are things that you should be practicing on a daily basis anyway. And I think that one of those, zooming in on framing up front, super important. I think a lot of people have been working on a project for a while, and by the time you talk to someone about it, by the time you're summarizing it, it's really hard to pull yourself out and have beginner's mind. So you kind of go from 0 to 100 miles per hour, going straight into this like really specific thing, when really what you want to do is set the stage for what are we even talking about? That's huge. In 2 to 3 sentences, what are we talking about and what do I need from you? So we're here today to talk about my proposal for X. As a reminder, we left off last month, you saying you wanted to hear more on this. I have now come back with a couple suggestions on what to do. And I would like to get your input on gaps that you see. Or I would like to get your initial thoughts to make sure we're aligned going the right direction. Or I would like to, whatever, right? Whatever it is that you are looking for from the person that you're presenting to. You can do that in 1 minute. So it's something that I think you should kick off almost every conversation with. This is not like a 15-minute spiel in the beginning. Like this is 1 minute of context setting that then allows your recipient to absorb and receive the gifts of what you're about to give them, all the evidence, the data, the context that you're about to give them, they're going to be able to receive that in a much easier, low cognitive load way because you framed up front. You invested that 1 minute in framing up front. It makes a huge, huge difference.
I 100% agree. And I think you said that you can do it. I think you have to do it. Also, one of the things like in the inverse that we always talk about is I think we are still drastically under communicating in companies nowadays the current product strategy, right? So like what is going on? Why are we doing what we do and so forth, right? So like almost of all the product leaders that I admired and also got to talk to in the days, they always said the same thing. You're talking about the reasons on why we are in this business until it comes out of your ears in every all hands, even if it's just like a 30-second kind of summarization, because there's always this one guy that was not listening or was not present, or someone was on holiday, someone comes back and so forth. But you can turn this around because the same also happens now on the micro level with someone's world as a product manager or like a product team and so forth. I, as an executive, cannot know what's going on in detail in every individual team. But yet, a lot of people are acting like this quite often, exactly in the way that you said, right? Like they're omitting like these summaries and so forth. And sometimes you also do not know that specific context is just missing. But it is very taxing on the mind of someone that is just like constantly like shifting from one team to the next one if these introductions are missing. And I find that extremely important. And just like on a last point of this, at least that's how I am doing it. I always try to make sure that in every communication that I have in a high stakes meeting, and a high stakes meeting for me would be something like, hey, like you talk to the board or like you talk to the CEO or so forth. When I do bring terms that have not been fallen before, for instance, I don't know, our SQLs or MQLs and so forth, I kind of define them again, right? So like there needs to be a clarification of what we talk about. You would not believe with how many basics in standard communication is just going wrong because both sides think they talk about the same stuff, but they actually don't. If a conversation sounds like, oh, we should generate more leads, and that's the entire thing, it's probably going to go wrong somewhere. What kind of leads? How many? And so forth, right? So we need to be particular. We need to be specific. At least that's how I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, there are so many things in there that you mentioned that I want to touch on. I think you need to assume that your recipient is context switching and task switching. So them joining your meeting is a context switch from whatever they were doing before. And they're arriving with a cold start. They're arriving still shell-shocked from their previous meeting, forgetting why we're doing this meeting, and like quickly, in like literally 10 seconds before hopping on the call, or like as Zoom is like loading, trying to remember who is this person and what are we talking about. So, right, like you're not, because we all do that, okay? And so it's not like the person is like, has been like waiting for this meeting all day and like is like super prepped, okay? So one, you need to assume that your recipient is not really prepped at all and coming in cold. And then second, during the meeting, they are probably multitasking. I read this terrifying, but also very believable stat about, I'm going to butcher the actual number, but it was something like 93%, and we should fact check this after, but 93% of people multitask in meetings. So you're like in a Zoom meeting, but you're also kind of checking Slack. You're also kind of looking at your phone. You're checking email a little bit. You might be talking to someone in the Zoom chat, but not really listening to the speaker. So that kind of multitasking, over 90% of people are doing. So it is very safe to assume that whoever you're talking to is not listening with their full brain. It's not their full attention, right? So when you account for these factors, it becomes then so obvious why you really need to be explicit. You need to frame up front. You need to remind people why we are talking about the thing we're talking about. And you need to try to reduce the cognitive load as much as possible. This is why you need to make it very easy for people to understand you. Because if it is difficult to understand you, then they just won't listen. They just won't try, or it's just going to go over their head. And then you miss one thing, then you miss the other, and you miss the other. And so I really think that cognitive load is the enemy. I'm a very big proponent of anti-cognitive load. And it creeps in so many different ways. And I think it's a tax that we put on other people when we do not put enough thought into how do we clarify this message as much as possible? How do we make it super easy for the other person to understand what it is that we're saying? Anything that you are not clarifying, you are essentially dumping on the other person to sift through. You're like dumping a bunch of pile of shit in their path saying like, sort this into pile A and pile B, right? No, like I need to sort that shit into pile A and pile B, okay? Like that is my responsibility. If I want you to listen, I need to sort it into pile A and pile B.
I think that's very true. And this is actually on top of my mind quite a lot when it comes to what we, despite knowing better, assume is going to stick with someone in a conversation versus what actually sticks with them. I don't know, for any, like even 15 minutes after a talk, especially if you do context switching and so forth. And we constantly overestimate it. And you can, by the way, there's a very simple kind of litmus test that you can do on this. And this is when you prepare a presentation towards a group of people and you have an hour of assigned time and you get it stressed, right? Like you're like, oh my God, I don't know whether I have enough material. Can almost guarantee you that what's going to happen is that you're going to be halfway through your presentation when the hour is over because you misjudge how much information you actually have to say. You misjudge how many questions might be there from the audience. And so there's just so many factors that are just going wrong. And I find this very fascinating because I'm very aware of this fact. I also have some methods to kind of deal with this and so forth. But I think what helped me a lot to kind of frame this is to always think about it in this way. It matters a big, big deal when you say what. The things that you want to have clarified in a high stakes call have to come at the beginning. Make sure that whatever is important is going to be at the beginning for two reasons. First of all, time. Second is attention, right? Because if we start to just like, oh, okay, let's sort all the problems alphabetically and let's just go through all these things that we want to get through because this is on the top of my task list. Don't do that. Always think about what is the number one thing that I want to have getting done before we go over. So for instance, if it's very important for you today to just talk about, I don't know, like my salary increase, do it first. Don't do it last just because you're like, like a little bit uncomfortable. Let's just break the ice first. No. Just do the important things at the beginning. That's at least how I'm thinking about it, because it's very easy to kind of lose people because of this bandwidth thing, exactly in the way that you said. You need to be able to summarize things way, way, way simpler than you think.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, maybe the final point on this is that I think oftentimes when I send out an article, which is communicating with other people as well, I always think, this is too basic. Like, because I keep talking about it all the time, because I'm in this world all the time about the topics that I write about. But for the people who are reading it, it might be sometimes even going over their head, because they're not talking about it all the time, but they are the audience.
Yeah, completely agree.
Okay, so here's an interesting problem. We have a business case, we have an idea, we did the legwork, we think we have conviction, we don't have experience, but we know that we want to do something. So I'm going to come to you now, Wes, and I'm going to present you some cases and so forth, but you're not someone from my silo. So you're a sales leader, and I'm a product person, just like hypothetically. How do I make sure that the language that I use or the way that I present it or anything in that way is the correct one? Do you have any concepts on this one in the sense of like, how can we ensure that what I'm telling you can't even land in the first place because you're from a different silo? Like, for instance, you're the sales leader.
Yeah, I think the most important thing when you are appealing to someone outside of your function, outside of your team, is to take a moment to think about what is important to this person. And if you are not sure, I encourage you to look at proxies. So proxies like their function, their title, their department, their team, the strategies that their team is currently working on, right? Those are all proxies that give you clues as to what might be important and compelling for this person. And then you want to try to fit whatever your initiative is, your idea is, under an existing priority that they already care about. This is you entering their world. You always want to enter their world and structure your idea in a frame that makes sense for them. Most people do the opposite. They expect people to come into their world, right? They have an idea and then they just say it the way that, what they think is cool about it, what they think is important about it, what they think is urgent about it. And they expect other people to enter their world and have to adjust their frame. And most people won't do that for a bunch of reasons. And so if you care about someone buying into your idea, you have to enter their world. You have to do the heavy lifting in terms of how do I frame this in terms that they understand and are more likely to be compelled by, which might be very different reasons than your initial reason for wanting to do the thing or why it's important for your team. You might skip over all the reasons why it's important for your team, right? Only focus on what is important for this person and their team. What is the upside for them or for the organization, or, how does this fit into something that they already committed to helping on, for example? Really, using their lens is the most helpful thing, I would say.
So I agree with this. So let's say this would be because you argue that we should speak in their language, right? So like I need to kind of learn some kind of new lingo in that sense, just like to overdraw the example a little bit. I think oftentimes we're unsure what is expected out of us. And this might seem like now like a very basic kind of advice. But for me as well, like the first time I had to talk really cross-functionally with leaders and companies, there's just a specific moment where you start to not be in your lane anymore. So you get now into territory where you don't know the language, you don't know the people. What really helps, and this sounds stupid, is to just ask. And what I mean with asking is give a little bit of a taste, asynchronous, of like, hey, we're going to sit together next week. We're going to do this and that. I was thinking about a rough structure in this case. Is this something that would help you in some way? Or like, or you just ask like, hey, what are the things that are important for you right now in the next year, or whatever you're going to advocate for? Because I feel like I had mentees in my past that said that I don't think I should ask this many questions. And I never got disappointed in people asking me many questions. What I always get disappointed in is like when they ask me a lot of questions at the end of the time when they're starting to present something, rather than, here 5 minutes, here another 5 minutes, here another 5 minutes, and then the big proposal is coming, like, hey, create a business case for project X, Y, and Z, and so forth. And what I mean with this is that treat this almost like agile software development. So if I know that I need to go to Wes in a month and I need to present something, make sure that along the way that I at least send you something beforehand that you have a choice in looking into. And you can also say like, sounds good to me, just go ahead, right? This is not about the idea per se. It's just about, hey, the form that I'm kind of working on, does this make sense? And I think this is one of the most, probably the easiest improvements that you can do. Did you just like take a little bit of attention on various ways instead of working up your anxiety and trying to do something right after 1 month? Because after 1 month of not coming back and forth, you're probably going to do something wrong.
The expectations are also higher. If I've been waiting for a month for a proposal, it should be pretty good, right? If I've waited 2 days before we align for the first high level aligning session, my expectations are going to be lower. So one of the things I teach in my course is to avoid grand reveals. I think we all get this impression from movies and TV shows where someone stands in front of a boardroom packed and unveils this thing and everyone gasps. And it's like, oh my God, they give this like Braveheart speech, or Mel Gibson, like riling people up. That just does not happen, okay, in normal work. That is way too risky. You really want to avoid a grand reveal, especially for more complex, ambiguous projects. The more complex and ambiguous the project is, the more variables there are, the more room there is for things to go wrong in every one of those variables. So it's way better for you to check in at multiple checkpoints to align and shorten the feedback loop. So instead of, hey, let me, present something to you, a proposal in 1 month, and expect a green light right off the bat, why don't I take a stab to think about some high-level directions you might want to go in? I'm going to circle back with you in 2 days, 3 days. Then we see if at a high level, are we even speaking the same language, thinking in the same direction? Because many times a leader will say, your CEO will come to you and say, I want you to do this. Like, come bring something back to me, right? The more senior you get, the more you get these, mandates to make a number go up or make this happen, right? And then you are having to go figure it out. And the way that you're thinking about it might be very aligned or might be actually very different than what your CEO had in mind. And so it's very expensive to realize that you actually misinterpreted something that they said after you've put multiple weeks into it. But it's very cheap to realize that in the actual conversation, because you clarified and you were brave enough to clarify right in that exact conversation, or 2 or 3 days later. So I'm a big proponent of this overall concept of de-risking in general in all areas of life. Okay, it is a big risk to spend a month working on some perfect proposal and drafting this really intense Notion strategy doc And, how can you de-risk that? Well, I can de-risk it by checking in at various points before I invest all that time.
This is very true. So, okay, so this might be a little bit funny because I just wanted to say like how people think decisions come to be and how they actually come to be. So very commonly in scale-ups, you have the CEO standing somewhere on a water cooler and he hears some conversation about something from the CRO and they says like, oh, you know what, this is a good idea. Then the PM is walking by and he says, hey, can we make like micropayments a thing on the platform, right? So like, can you bring me like, right? Like we could do this, right? Like, and so forth. And then they take this and some people think that this is good for them if they do not ask questions anymore and just do what the CEO says or someone that is higher up in the company after like hearing about it once. It's kind of like this idea of, oh, I'm the concierge in a hotel and the guest wants something and I make it happen. It's kind of like going as well a little bit into this Hollywood fantasy of like, oh, like the customer is the king and so forth, except that's not how any of these companies work. And the thing is, I have never ever said in my entire career as in any leadership form ever, I said, oh, Wes has not been in touch with me for a month. I think that means everything is fine. Never would I have said that at all. The way that I'm getting off your back, and I'm an ambitious person, is by hearing a lot from you in very little doses. And what I mean with that is that my job is to smell when something is not right. So a lot of product leadership and like organizational design is really around the fact of like, which pile of garbage that I have right now is smelling the most. That is my job. Because the things that I can delegate and that are manageable by others, I will delegate, right? So like, hey, we need to hire someone else. Okay, we can delegate this to the group product manager. This is a good thing. But the things that go wrong will always fall back on me. That is my job to kind of know how things smell. And things always smell bad if you don't air out the container they are in once in a while. That's how I'm thinking about it. And my advice is always make sure that a problem is your leader's problem and not your problem. And that means I'm bringing it to your attention. You can choose to act on it or you can choose not to act on it, but at least make it an okay thing. What I mean with that is I say something to you and you can just say like, okay, proceed. Or I can say, whoa, stop. That sounds very dangerous. Let's have a conversation about this right now because this sounds like this is going to go off the rails. But what you don't want to do is you do not want to have the lid on your Tupperware because it starts to stink, like my soda stream bottles that I'm drinking off that you are not approving of. I'm just saying, okay? It's like...
Yeah, I think in general, surprises are not good at work in general.
Yeah.
Just like, unless you're bringing a tray of donuts or something to the kitchenette, like that's the only type of surprise that's good. Any other type of surprise, your leader does not want.
I don't like these either because they make me fat. And then I feel like, oh, I have to eat it because this person now brought me, right? Like so. But anyway, so the way that I actually say this to my PMs, and they're going to laugh if they're listening to this, is that I want you to know how a meeting ends before it happens. And then they're always like, how am I supposed to do that? I'm just like, especially in critical multiplayer meetings where you have multiple people from leadership. What you don't want to have is you want to surprise one person in the meeting with something that is going to go against something that you do not know about, that is interacting with another person that is on the call, because now they cannot speak openly about it as well. It's not about politics necessarily. It just means that you should align with people before the meeting sufficiently enough so the meeting is about figuring the things out that cannot be handled asynchronous. Because of lack of attention or whatever it is, like I don't know, getting a budget approval. As you said, it's a long process, right? But you cannot know what's going on behind the scenes and so forth. And what you really want to avoid is like putting someone into a bad place, because it doesn't matter whether you're doing it intentionally. If you're doing it consistently, then you're going to be labeled as the person that leaves the lid on the Tupperware all the time. And then the piles start to stink.
I like thinking about where does a certain instinct come from? Like, what's the root cause? And I think that when people don't ask clarifying questions and don't align on the way, it comes from this notion that I want to look independent. I want to look like I can operate autonomously, right? Because most leaders want their people to be ever more autonomous. But operating autonomously doesn't mean squirreling away, working silently, for 3 weeks without sharing anything about what you're doing and then popping back up for that grand reveal. working autonomously actually means that your leader doesn't have to be paranoid and worried about breathing down your neck, asking about details because they can't trust that you're going to be sharing the right information at the right time, right? So you operating autonomously is actually, you should be communicating more, not less. You should be communicating and sharing what you are thinking, what are potential risks of what's going on, what are things that were unexpected as you were executing. All of those things actually increase your leaders' trust in you to operate autonomously because they can then trust that you have good judgment around surfacing things that you should be surfacing.
That is such a great summary. I don't even know what to say to it. It was really, really good. No, it's really, really good. So let's say we agree to everything that we've said so far. This is how we want to be communicated with. And you have founded a lot of companies. You've been VC backed and so forth. And you're probably not going to end up somewhere where you're not founding another 10 companies. So the next company that you found, where you have reign over like how, the company culture is and so forth, what is the ideal structure where this can actually happen for people? And the reason why I'm asking this is I've listened to a podcast with Sundar Pichai where he said about 1 or 2 years ago, he struggles with the concept of rewarding people only for good impact. And I'm bringing this up because you said before something very good, that you said what matters is the good decision and not necessarily just the impact. But at the same time, we have this culture a little bit in tech predominantly that we just celebrate, oh, look at all these succeeded experiments, look at the funding that we got, right? Like we're almost kind of only celebrating the success versus what you're saying is what we should do is like the good decisions should matter, because at the same time, you also know that you're not going to get recognition from your colleagues if you create a good business case that convinces someone to not do something. I know this is a bit of a complex question in this regard, but I started to come around a little bit on this view of Sundar, where I just feel like I actually do think we need to find some ways to also encourage and also celebrate these good decisions in some kind of way. But then it cannot only be about the impact that the good ones have that are moving the needles upwards. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, Annie Duke has a concept that she calls resulting that I think captures this really well. And it's this idea that resulting is basically only celebrating the result of a decision and assuming that a good result meant that there was a good decision and a bad result meant there was a bad decision. But there are many times when a good decision and a good process led to a bad outcome or an unexpected outcome. And it was not because that decision was bad or the process was bad. The person could have made, or the team could have made, the best decision that they could have at the moment. And I think it's so important not to fall prey to resulting. And I think that's partially what you were saying. The way that I think you create a culture where you celebrate the good decisions, regardless of, what ends up happening, is by celebrating rigorous thinking. So rigorous thinking is a concept I have where it's basically being thoughtful about the tactics that you are choosing and the strategies that you're making, thinking a couple steps ahead, and being a bit more thoughtful about the investments that you're making. And I find that sometimes people just skip the rigorous thinking and jump straight into an experiment or jump straight into taking action or jump straight into a decision or advocating for something, and taking those extra moments to think about, why are we doing this? Is this really the best way to get to our goal? Is this the most efficient and effective way? What might go wrong? Are there avoidable problems that we can easily foresee? That's kind of, to me, it's the opposite of jumping too quickly into prototyping, into action. The whole idea of move fast, break things, the bias towards action. Of course, the bias towards action is good. You don't want to just think and not do anything. But I think that the downside of glorifying action first, action only is you sometimes jump into something and then, you make a bunch of mistakes. And if you literally thought about it for 5 minutes, you would have foreseen that those were mistakes that you would have made. So let's just take that 5 minutes. Okay. I'm not saying like, let's take 50 days. I'm saying 5 minutes to just think about what might we be able to avoid if we just thought about this a little bit more. And so when my teams do that, I heavily reward it. I think it's so important to celebrate the behavior that you want to see. So when my teams think rigorously and they vet their own ideas before bringing it to me, and they share, here's what could potentially go wrong, or here are the risks, or here's the upside and the downside, here are the trade-offs. Here's why I think we should prioritize this versus other potential tactics that we're considering. When they come to me with these ideas, these are all still very much ideas. Like, we still need to vet them, right? Like, they're based on assumptions, etc. But I am celebrating that they did that. I'm celebrating and rewarding that they took time to think about this in a more strategic way, regardless of what happens, because the fact that they did that is allowing us to have a more productive conversation. So I might actually disagree with some of what they came up with, right? There's many proposals that have come across my desk where I actually disagree with an insight, or I disagree with the takeaway someone had. Once I look at the data myself or look at the primary evidence myself, I'm like, I actually have the opposite conclusion potentially. So, in those cases, I don't say, celebrating doesn't mean, wow, I love these ideas. They're so awesome. I agree. No, I'm not going to say that I agree with something I don't agree with. That's dangerous, right? I'm going to say, I love that you thought about all these different factors. I love that you took time to think about what could go wrong, et cetera, et cetera. We need to vet some of these. And I don't necessarily agree with all the conclusions you came up with, but I'm glad that you are thinking more deeply. So that's an example of celebrating without necessarily agreeing with the content of what, your direct report might have necessarily done. And I think that by celebrating and rewarding the process, the thinking behind whatever conclusion they might have come up with, that's how you encourage them to continue doing that and continue building that muscle.
I really, really like this. And I also want to just add on something that I see, ironically, predominantly in American companies. I don't know whether this is just now selection bias on my behalf. When you do that, try not to make it performative in the sense of like it feels like a participation trophy because you just say that in every meeting. I come across as quite tough, I think, at least from the 360 reviews that I receive from people inside of companies. But I think, and I struggle with this quite a lot because I felt always like, this is not how I want to come across. But the good side about this is that if you give a compliment and people know that you mean it, because exactly in the way that you said, I appreciate the effort that you've put into this. And I'm not just saying this to everything that you do or like just stuff that is just sloppy and so forth. It really means something to people. And I also feel like that they are starting to pick up on it. And maybe this is a little bit of a tangential thought on what you said when you said, like, I'm looking myself into the numbers. I appreciate it so much when someone is giving me something that is easy to check. Good example would be if you have a summary about something and you make a claim, here's the source. Please link it. Don't tell me to search on the Google Drive for this particular board presentation and so forth. But this goes to your very initial point. If you give already context on like, hey, why are we doing this? Like based on this and that, it should be already in your intro. Here's why we're doing this. Maybe also a link to the particular dashboard and so forth where you have the numbers for. But don't make me have to go back to you to get at least some level of data. I'm not always like a crazy data deep dive, but don't be obscure about this stuff. Is this something that I just really don't like because then it smells again, right? Like it smells like something is wrong. And I personally also love it when people say like, hey, they're getting challenged and they just say like, hey, oh, actually, I don't know. Let me get back to you on this. I really don't know. But where it usually goes really off the rails is when you challenge someone and then you notice they start to stumble. Oh, we kind of deterred this last time in the last meeting, but they don't really know like where it really came from. And it's just like, hey, just check it, but don't insist on it. And this is to also your point where people start to fall in love with their ideas and they feel like, oh, I have to defend this now. No, you don't, because we're not perfect, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm a big proponent of letting people inspect your ideas. So you should inspect your own ideas, but you should also make it easy for others to inspect. Notice that inspect is different from look at vaguely and casually, okay? Inspecting is holding something and looking at it 360 in great detail, being able to see where there are cracks, where there are dents, where there are holes, right? And I find that a lot of people make the mistake of being too high level when they share something. They don't give the other person enough to be able to form an opinion or to be able to form their perspective or to be able to see where can I help strengthen this idea because you've just been too vague about it. And then if I want more information, I now need to do extra work to draw that information out of you, which is so annoying, right? So there is such a thing as being too concise and you want to avoid that, right? And so by offering additional context, making it easy for the other person to parse through, right? So you're putting the main point at the top and then context below. If the person wants more context, they can continue reading, they can click through, they can verify, the data that you included, and you give them agency. The agency piece is huge, especially when you are communicating complex information that cannot simply be 2 to 3 lines only, right? The 2 to 3 lines is to open up and to frame up front. And then you are getting into the meat and the context. And so when you put the main point up front and then context below, if the person agrees with the executive summary, the top, then they can move on. Great, done. If they are skeptical though, then they can dig deeper and they already have everything that they need to be able to dig deeper without needing to have this annoying back and forth, asking a bunch of questions. Can you send this? Can you share more about this, et cetera, et cetera. So that's part one. I think part two about what you said was when people start to get nervous when they get a question that they're not sure how to answer, they start fibbing their way through it. So I have mixed feelings about I'll get back to you. So saying I'll get back to you. On the one hand, saying I'll get back to you is for sure better than trying to pretend like you know what you're talking about if you don't. So on the scale of like, definitely don't try to lie or like overextend, okay? Because that's the worst, just don't do it. One step better is saying, I don't know, I'll look into it, I'll get back to you. Okay. I think that there's an even better thing you can do though. This does require a bit of confidence, which is, can I try to figure out the question behind the question? Is there something that this person is asking where they're saying like, hey, what's this specific number, right? Maybe I don't know that number off the top of my head. I need to look into it. But why are they asking about this number? What could they be wanting to know? And so is there a way that I can validate what they might be wanting to know with something else that I do have in the moment while we have each other without needing to extend that feedback loop, right? So I have an example. So let's say you are a product marketing manager and you're presenting something and your VP of marketing says, thanks for presenting this messaging for this new launch. Great. What's the TAM? What's the total addressable market for this thing? This actually happened with one of my newsletter readers. And my newsletter reader said, oh, I'm not sure what the TAM is. I need to look into it. I think the product manager who initially vetted this feature has that and said, I'll get back to you. So one thing that you could do if you were that product marketing manager, if you don't know the TAM, you might want to validate why could they be asking this? Usually, and this is me making a hypothesis, okay? If someone is asking about the TAM for this feature that I thought we were already aligned on, they might be having second thoughts on whether this feature still makes sense to invest in. Or what degree do we want to invest in this, right? They might have information that I don't have about shifts happening elsewhere in the business, other priorities, et cetera, where this feature that I've been working on the messaging on is like not as important as it once was, for example, right? And so you might want to say something like, great question. I'm not sure what the TAM is. I can definitely look into it. Is there, are you now thinking that the market size for this feature might not be as big as you initially thought when we started working on this 3 months ago? Right? So I'm validating and getting a bit more information from that person. Now that VP can say, yeah, actually, like we've gotten some data recently that like we thought this feature was like something people really wanted, but turns out like, some new data points have now changed our thinking, et cetera, et cetera. So that actually addresses whatever they were wanting to ask about the TAM in the first place.
Okay. So I'm trying to kind of disagree a little bit.
Okay.
Because I think you could start with, I'll get back to you on this, but you only say that at the point where you're 100% sure that what the person wants to know, you can also get. So good example would be, if you ask me about the TAM, this is one of these questions that sounds simple. And then people get all like tangled up in really weird shit, right? Like they're not sure like anymore, like, oh, I've never done this. Like the CEO asked me for this and I promised it to them, right? Like what this is, I wrote an article about this, how to get in trouble really fast with people, is if you start to promise them stuff just to get out of a sticky situation, right? So I'm not trying to say that you should just say like, hey, yeah, okay, like I'll get back to you. You should, at this point, you should only do this when you absolutely know where to get a very specific information, also what it is for. So I do agree with you. I just flip it around a little bit where I just say like, okay, I can get this back to you once I understand what they actually want to know. So I think I agree.
Yeah.
One more question on you before we conclude the episode. Do you do anything different when you have to present something to someone that needs to then sell this idea to someone else? So it is not particularly anymore in your control. So let's say PM to a CPO, and then the CPO needs to fit it into the roadmap that is going to, needs to be approved by the entire leadership team and so forth. But it is essentially outside of your hand. And the reason why I'm saying this is when you come with really good research, and I had this a couple of times, you go to someone with really good research, you give it to them, hey, Wes, look, here's what I'm doing, and so forth. But I kind of hide away the validation with me. Then my idea with a validation is turning into a secondhand opinion with you. So when you go then to the next person to talk about, you cannot defend the idea because you don't have access to the validation because I did not make it consumable and defendable for you to actually use. And then you have these funny ideas where someone says, or like these situations where someone says like, oh, this should not be a problem. And then a week later, oh, we decided not to do it. And you're just like, but like, why? Like the case was so good, like, and then you just, yeah, whatever, your stuff just died and you were not in the room when it did.
Yes, I think this is a very real situation to control for. So the first thing is I try to create something that is as forwardable and usable as possible. Because when I think about de-risking, I don't want to trust the person I'm sending this to be able to make this argument as good as I would have made it, as well as I would have made it. Right. So I want to try to reduce the amount of work that they have to do to make their life easy, but also to reduce the chances that they mess up or explain this incorrectly or right. So I try to create something that they can pretty much use verbatim. And I think about who are they going to be presenting to? So if I'm sending this to my CPO and she's going to be sending it to the CEO, then I'm thinking, okay, what does the CEO need to know? And then I create something that is as instantly shareable as I can.
Do you have a specific template that you use or anything? I mean, you probably are teaching this in the course as well, but like for me, it's always like, I always try to make something that you can mark, copy and paste. So not a slide, not a copy of a slide. I'm very particular about this. For some reason, I just believe that if you can copy paste something easier, then it's going to land more likely in an email or in a mobile phone where you can look at it, like depending on where you meet someone, like maybe like a little bit showing down my age on this part. But I think a concise summary that you can send over Slack that is readable within a minute on a specific idea, especially, let's say we have this talk and I know you're going to go now into a leadership meeting, make sure that the written summary is somewhere where this person can read off in a remote meeting, because we're multitasking all the time. So how can I make you look good? And that's what I'm thinking, like something that you can do while multitasking. This is so awful.
Yeah, I think part of creating something that the person can use as is taking into account the medium and setting where they're going to have that conversation. So sometimes something really short that they're going to be able to say out loud to quickly describe, this proposal is great. Other times it might be a strategy doc, a 3-page doc, in Notion or Google Docs or whatever, that the person they're presenting to might want to access and be able to read and be able to comment on and be able to share more, thoughtful analysis on, right? To kind of gut check the assumptions that we're making. So depending on what setting it's going to be, I'm creating for that setting, right? Like if the person is going to be presenting it in a leadership team meeting and it's going to be verbal and they're going to have 3 minutes to cover a range of topics, this being one of them, I'm creating something for that setting, right? Then that's where like the doc doesn't really make as much sense. I might still create the doc as a backup for that person, but I'm creating a script for them essentially that they can read out and sound like them. But then if it's, the other way where the person they're presenting to wants to really get in the meat of an idea to vet it because it's at that stage where they want to get in the weeds, then I'm creating something for that. So really understanding the medium and setting, I think is very important when you're figuring out how do I prep this person essentially.
Yeah, I think this closes the circle absolutely perfect because this goes to I think it was one of your first points where you said that you need to know what the person, like what are their goals and like what is their context and so forth. And how many people are really asking the CEO afterwards, hey, so in which meeting are you going to present this? Is this going to be in person or like, is this going to be over beer, like in a board meeting afterwards and so forth? Don't be afraid to ask these questions because thinking about like whether what I'm sending you is a 10-page Notion page might be the completely wrong format exactly for this. I'm personally, by the way, a big fan of digital sales rooms. So I do this with my advising clients where I just have a Notion page with sub pages where it's very easy for them to kind of check on the latest state on like, hey, what did we agree on? What were the conditions and so forth? It's kind of like also like a business case. What are the high level things that we are working on right now that are really top of mind? And yeah, so the context is different everywhere, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So Wes, we've been going over 1 hour. I'm really sorry. I think we should have booked like 3 hours for this. And I don't want to keep you any longer. This was a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much. Do you want people to reach out to you? If so, where should they do it? And yeah, when is your next cohort coming up as well? I believe on Maven.
Yes. So you can find me at weskao.com. I'm also on LinkedIn, and my newsletter is newsletter.weskao.com. And then my Maven course, I have a cohort coming up in December that's sold out. And so the next one that's open for enrollment right now is February 2025.
And I highly recommend this. I really consider you to be absolutely fantastic when it comes to communication. And I still learn from you as well, especially with these bloody titles. You're so good at those. You're so good at these summaries. And yeah, so thank you very much for coming today. This was a fantastic conversation. I hope it was not the last time. So that's it.
Thank you so much, Leah.
Thank you so much for listening to The Product Tea with Leah. If you don't have enough yet, you can subscribe to my podcast right now on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or you can head to my website, leahtarin.com, which is leahtarin.com, where you can find much more of my material or just want to work with me.